The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows over a bustling park. Office workers rushed past, their hurried footsteps and the hum of distant traffic forming the background symphony of city life. On a small wooden bench tucked under a tree, Emily sat quietly, her homemade lunch resting on her lap. She loved her midday breaks, a small escape from the chaos of her desk job at the local nonprofit. Unwrapping her sandwich, Emily took a bite, savoring the comforting taste of her mom's recipe. As she glanced around, her eyes fell on an elderly man shuffling near a trash can a few feet away. His clothes were tattered, his shoes barely holding together, and his face etched with lines of hardship. He rummaged through the bin, pulling out a crumpled paper bag before sighing in defeat. Emily's heart ached. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should approach him. What if he gets offended? She thought. But then she remembered her own struggles, growing up with very little, often relying on the kindness of strangers. Gathering her courage, she called out softly, "Excuse me, sir?" The man looked up, startled. Emily held out half of her sandwich and an apple. "I thought you might be hungry," she said with a warm smile. The man hesitated, his eyes flickering between Emily and the food. Finally, he stepped closer, his hands trembling as he took her offering. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You didn't have to." Emily smiled brighter. Everyone needs a little kindness sometimes. As the man sat down on a nearby bench, savoring his first bite, Emily felt an unexpected warmth in her chest. A quiet moment of connection amid the chaos of the world. The park buzzed with the sound of footsteps and laughter. But for Emily, the world seemed to shrink to just her and the man before her. Sitting awkwardly on the edge of the bench, the homeless man nibbled on the sandwich Emily had given him. His hands, calloused and trembling, held the food like it was something precious. Emily leaned forward slightly, breaking the silence. "I'm Emily. What's your name?" The man glanced up, his weathered face softening for a moment. "James," he replied, his voice low and raspy. She smiled warmly. "It's nice to meet you, James." James hesitated, then nodded. After a beat, he added, "I wasn't always like this, you know. I had a good life once. Family, a home. But I made some bad decisions. Lost it all." His voice carried a tinge of bitterness, but mostly regret. Emily's heart ached at his words. She knew what it felt like to face life's hardships. "I grew up in a poor neighborhood," she said softly. "It wasn't easy. My parents worked day and night to give me a better life, but I saw how close we were to losing it all sometimes. I guess I understand at least a little." James gave her a long look, his expression unreadable. "You remind me of someone important," he murmured. "Who?" Emily asked, curious. Before James could answer, a group of office workers strolled by, their conversation halting as they glanced disapprovingly at Emily and James. One of them whispered, loud enough for Emily to hear, "Why is she wasting her time with him?" Emily felt the sting of their words but forced herself to focus on James. "People can be so quick to judge," she said, more to herself than him. James chuckled dryly, a sound full of irony. "You're different, Emily. Most people wouldn't even look at me, let alone share their lunch." His words stayed with her, sparking something deep within, a connection that felt far more significant than she could understand in that moment. As James finished the sandwich, Emily noticed how frail he looked, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the apple she'd given him. The sight tugged at her heart. "You shouldn't be eating scraps from a trash can," she said gently. "Let me buy you a proper meal." James shook his head quickly, his cheeks coloring with embarrassment. No, you've done more than enough already. I can't let you do that." Emily leaned forward, her voice firm but kind. "It's no trouble, James. Everyone deserves kindness, especially you. Please let me do this." He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the ground. Finally, with a reluctant nod, he agreed. "All right," he murmured, "but only because you're so stubborn." Together, they walked to a small cafe at the corner of the park. The bell above the door jingled as they entered, but the cheerful sound was quickly overshadowed by the silence that followed. Patrons turned to stare, their eyes narrowing at James's ragged appearance. A couple near the counter whispered to each other, their expressions tinged with disdain. Even the cashier seemed uncomfortable, her smile faltering as she greeted them. Emily ignored them all. She led James to a table by the window and handed him a menu. "Order whatever you like," she said warmly. James looked uneasy, shifting in his seat. "People are staring," he muttered, glancing around. "Let them stare," Emily replied, her voice unwavering. "They don't know your story. Everyone deserves kindness, no matter what they look like or where they've been." James blinked at her, his expression softening. For a moment he seemed lost for words. As they ate, James opened up more. "It's been a long time since someone treated me like a human being," he admitted. "Most people just pass by. You're different, Emily. Most wouldn't care." Her eyes met his, her smile tinged with sadness. "I think people forget how easy it is to show a little compassion. It costs nothing but can mean everything." James nodded, his voice growing quieter. "If I could go back and change things, maybe I wouldn't have ended up like this. I made mistakes, big ones." He paused, his eyes distant. "But today, you've reminded me that there's still good in the world." Emily felt the sincerity in his words, the weight of a man carrying years of regret. Their connection deepened, and for the first time, James seemed to stand a little taller as James slowly ate his soup, savoring each bite as though it was the best meal he'd had in years. His eyes drifted to Emily's company ID badge clipped to the pocket of her blazer. The logo, a simple tree with open hands as its roots, caught his attention. "What's that?" James asked, gesturing to the badge. Emily glanced down and smiled. "Oh, this? I work for a nonprofit called New Roots. We help underprivileged families with housing, food, and education programs. It's not a big organization, but we do what we can." James paused mid-bite, his eyes fixed on her. "You do all that?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Emily nodded, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's not easy. We're constantly struggling for funding. But I grew up in a tough situation myself, so I know how much it can mean to people who need help. It's worth it." James set his spoon down, his hands trembling slightly. "That's noble work," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His gaze turned distant, and for a moment, it looked as though he was lost in a memory. Emily tilted her head, noticing the shift in his demeanor. "Are you okay?" He blinked, returning to the present. Yeah, just thinking." James then leaned forward, a flicker of intensity in his eyes. "What do you hope to do with it? The nonprofit, I mean, if you had all the resources you needed, what would you do?" Emily hesitated, surprised by his sudden interest. "Well, we'd expand, build a larger shelter, hire more staff, and offer vocational training. We could really change lives." She laughed softly, a tinge of sadness in her tone. "But dreams like that require money, and we're barely keeping the lights on as it is." James nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "You have a good heart, Emily. People like you are rare." As the meal wound down, Emily checked her watch, realizing she needed to head back to work. She stood, reaching for her bag. "It was really nice talking to you, James. I hope this meal gave you a little break from the rough days." James stood too, suddenly looking anxious. "Wait," he said quickly. "I want to thank you." "Properly." Emily smiled, shaking her head. "You don't owe me anything, James. It was my pleasure." "No," he insisted, his tone firm but not aggressive. "I want to see you again. Please, just one more time." Emily hesitated, sensing the urgency in his voice. Something about it felt important, though she couldn't put her finger on why. Finally, she nodded. "Okay. Same place, same time next week." James let out a sigh of relief, his shoulders relaxing. "Thank you," he said. As she left the cafe, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to James than met the eye. His interest in her nonprofit and his insistence on meeting again left her with questions she couldn't yet answer. A week later, Emily sat at her desk, sorting through the usual pile of emails and paperwork when an elegant envelope caught her eye. It was embossed with gold trim, and inside was an invitation to a high-profile charity gala hosted by a mysterious benefactor. Emily's nonprofit, New Roots, had been chosen as one of the featured organizations. Excited but nervous, she arrived at the event that Friday evening. The gala was held in a grand ballroom, its glittering chandeliers casting a warm glow over the lavish decor. Tables were adorned with floral centerpieces and gold-rimmed plates, and the air hummed with the chatter of the city's wealthiest philanthropists. Emily adjusted her modest dress, feeling slightly out of place among the glamorous gowns and tailored suits. She reminded herself that this was about the nonprofit. It didn't matter if she felt like a small fish in a big pond. As the evening progressed, Emily mingled awkwardly, trying to network with donors. She couldn't help but feel invisible amidst the sea of powerful, affluent guests. Then the lights dimmed, and the host took the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer said, "please welcome our benefactor and visionary, Mr. James Hamilton." Polite applause filled the room as a tall, well-dressed man approached the podium. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. Couldn't be. But it was. James, the homeless man she had shared her lunch with, now stood before her, dressed in a tailored suit and radiating confidence. His grizzled beard was trimmed, his posture straight, and his demeanor magnetic. The room fell silent as whispers rippled through the crowd. "Thank you for being here tonight," James began, his voice steady and commanding. "I want to share a story with you. A personal journey that changed my life and, I hope, will inspire all of you." Emily's hands clutched the sides of her chair as James continued. "Over the past several months, I've been living on the streets, blending in with those society often overlooks. I needed to see the world from their perspective, to truly understand their struggles." Gasps erupted from the audience, but James pressed on. "I met many incredible people during that time, but one encounter stood out. One person reminded me of the power of kindness and the impact it can have." He paused, scanning the crowd until his eyes locked with Emily's. She felt her heart race as his gaze softened. "That person," James continued, "is here tonight. Her name is Emily." The spotlight swung to Emily, and she felt every pair of eyes in the room turn toward her. The whispers grew louder as her cheeks flushed with heat. James smiled warmly. "Emily shared her lunch with me when she had no reason to. She treated me with dignity when others looked the other way. Her compassion reminded me of why I started my journey in the first place." Emily's eyes filled with tears as James recounted their conversation, sharing how her openness and dedication to her nonprofit reignited his faith in humanity. "Emily's kindness reminded me of the responsibility I carry," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "Tonight, I am pledging a $10 million donation to New Roots to help families in need. And I urge all of you to join me in supporting this vital cause." The room erupted in applause, but Emily could only sit, stunned and overwhelmed. As James stepped down from the stage, he approached her. "Thank you, Emily," he said softly. "You didn't just share your lunch that day, you shared hope. And that's priceless." Emily could only nod, her words lost amidst the flood of emotion. Her small act of kindness had sparked a ripple effect she never could have imagined as the applause roared through the grand ballroom. Emily remained frozen in her seat, her hands trembling. The magnitude of what had just happened was too much to process. Around her, murmurs of awe and admiration filled the air, but all she could hear was the pounding of her heart. James, now standing tall and confident, gestured for the room to quiet down. The chatter subsided, and he returned to the microphone, his eyes glistening with emotion. "Before we continue," James began, his voice steady yet filled with warmth, "I want to take a moment to express my gratitude to someone extraordinary." He turned to Emily, and the spotlight once again found her. Emily felt a wave of heat flush her cheeks as James continued. "Emily didn't just share her lunch with me that day. She shared something far more valuable: kindness, dignity, and humanity. When everyone else turned away, she saw me as a person, not a problem. And for that, I will be forever grateful." The crowd erupted in applause, but James wasn't finished. Acts of kindness like Emily's remind us that change doesn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes, it begins with something as simple as sharing a sandwich, Emily blinked back tears, her throat tight. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. James turned back to the audience, his tone shifting to one of determination. It's because of Emily's compassion and her dedication to helping others that I've decided to make a significant contribution to New Roots. The room fell silent, anticipation thick in the air. James smiled, looking directly at Emily as he made the announcement. Tonight, I am pledging $10 million in Emily's name to New Roots. This donation will expand their programs, build new facilities, and ensure their work continues to uplift families for years to come. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by a thunderous standing ovation. Emily's hands flew to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. The sheer enormity of the donation and what it meant for her nonprofit was overwhelming. As James stepped off the stage and approached her, the applause grew louder. When he reached her, he extended a hand, but instead of shaking it, Emily stood and threw her arms around him in a heartfelt hug. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't even know what to say." James chuckled softly, his own eyes misty. "You've already said it, Emily. Your kindness said it all." The room watched the exchange with reverence, and many were visibly moved. For Emily, the moment was surreal, a culmination of years of hard work and a simple act of humanity that had changed everything. As the night wore on, donors approached Emily, offering their own pledges to support New Roots, inspired by James's story and her kindness. By the end of the evening, Emily realized that this wasn't just a reward, it was a responsibility. James's generosity had given her nonprofit a future, but it was her compassion that had sparked the change. From that moment on, she vowed to continue spreading kindness, knowing firsthand how powerful even the smallest act could be. As the gala began to wind down, Emily found herself standing on the balcony of the grand ballroom, gazing out at the city lights. The cool night air helped calm the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. She was still trying to process everything: the donation, James's story, and the incredible ripple effect of a single act of kindness. "Beautiful view, isn't it?" a familiar voice said softly. Emily turned to see James approaching, his suit jacket unbuttoned, his once polished demeanor now replaced with the same warmth she'd seen in him at the park. For a moment, they simply stood in silence, letting the weight of the night settle. "Thank you, James," Emily said finally, her voice quiet but filled with sincerity. "Not just for the donation but for everything, for believing in me, in New Roots. I don't think I'll ever be able to repay you." James smiled gently. "You've got it backward, Emily. It's me who owes you. That day in the park, I was at my lowest. I felt invisible, like the world had given up on me. And then you came along. You didn't see a homeless man, you saw a person. You reminded me of the power of kindness." Emily looked down, her cheeks flushing slightly. "It wasn't a big deal," she murmured. "Anyone could have done it. But they didn't," James replied firmly. "That's what makes you special, Emily. People like you are the real wealth of the world." She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes again, but she managed a small laugh. "Kindness doesn't need a reward, you know. I didn't help you that day expecting anything in return." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And that's exactly why you deserve it. Your selflessness reminded me that change starts with one person, one act." He paused, his voice softening. "You inspired me, Emily. You made me realize I need to do more, not just as a donor but as a person. I've spent years hiding behind my wealth, but it's time I use it to truly make a difference." Emily smiled, her heart swelling with admiration. "I think you're already doing that, James. And I know you'll do so much more." They stood together for a few more moments, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. Before James turned to leave, he reached out and clasped Emily's hand. "Promise me one thing," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "Keep doing what you're doing. Keep believing in people. You've already changed more lives than you know." Emily gripped his hand tightly, her resolve solidifying. "I promise," she said, "and I'll make sure to pay it forward, every single day." As James walked away, disappearing back into the crowd, Emily took a deep breath. The night had changed her, not just in terms of resources for new routes, but in her own perspective. With renewed vigor, Emily vowed to continue her mission, knowing now more than ever that even the smallest acts of kindness could change the world. New Roots was alive with energy and hope. Families gathered in the newly built dining hall, children laughed in brightly painted classrooms, and volunteers worked diligently in the job training center. Emily walked through the space, her heart swelling with pride as she witnessed the transformations unfolding around her. In one corner, a mother hugged her two young children after receiving keys to their new home. In another, a group of teenagers proudly presented their resumes after completing a vocational course. Everywhere Emily looked, there were smiles, laughter, and gratitude. Emily paused to take it all in, remembering how far they had come. What had once been a struggling nonprofit with barely enough resources to stay afloat was now a thriving hub of change, all thanks to one man's generosity and one small act of kindness. Back in her office, Emily sat at her desk, organizing plans for the next phase of the nonprofit's growth. A staff member knocked softly, handing her an envelope. She opened it curiously and found a handwritten note inside. "Emily, your kindness changed my life and reminded me of what truly matters. The world needs more people like you. Never stop believing in kindness, it changes the world. Gratefully, James." Tears welled up in her eyes as she held the note close. It was a reminder that even the smallest actions could create ripples that changed lives. As Emily placed the note on her desk, she turned back to her work, her resolve stronger than ever. Kindness wasn't just a gesture, it was a mission, and she was determined to keep spreading it one person at a time.